And for more on the crisis in Ukraine, I'm joined by Michael Kofman. He's a public policy scholar at the Wilson Center here in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the show. So we're hearing these accusations being traded back and forth between Kiev and Moscow, and we're still waiting to see actual proof that these tanks may have crossed the border. And we've heard so much coming from the Ukrainian politicians, but what are the people in Ukraine thinking now after all this time? We're not hearing much from the people. Are they willing to fight?
Well, I think people in Ukraine are worried that there's going to be another winter offensive starting up right now. These current recent allegations, this has been a pattern going back throughout the whole year. Russia naturally denies them. I don't think that's even the critical issue. I think it seems fairly evident that the agreements signed on September 5th in Minsk are not going to hold. The separatists seem to be increasing in numbers and arming, and so there's a very good probability that the ceasefire will completely break down and there will be another offensive. And it's unclear who necessarily will break the ceasefire first. Undoubtedly, both the new separatist republics and the Ukrainian government will accuse each other. But one way or another, there's a chance that this conflict will break out anew.
When you say break out anew, do you foresee a full-on military conflict between Ukraine and Russia?
No, I do not. I don't think Russia intends to use its army in Ukraine. And even when Russia's army did intervene briefly at the end of August, it was at most a week-long intervention. They defeated the Ukrainian army decisively and withdrew. Now, Russian forces have returned somewhat to the border, but I think Russia believes that the separatists are now strong enough, and I'll tell you, they probably have 20 to 25,000 fighters at this point, that they could carry on a fight and sustain any kind of offensive or defense on their own without the help of Russian troops. Therefore, I think a massive Russian involvement of tanks is quite unlikely.
President Putin is getting ready to attend the APEC meetings in Beijing. After that, he'll go to the G20 in Australia. Today, here Friday, Russia's currency crashed. Inflation is soaring there in the country. There are talks of more Western economic sanctions. What do you think will happen as Russia seems to plunge further into a recession?
Well, on the economic front, Russia's in very deep trouble. The ruble's in absolute free fall. A lot of that's due to speculation and the fact that Russia's central bank has basically, for now, abandoned efforts to burn foreign exchange reserves to sustain it. That, I think, is going to change. I think the Russian central bank will probably do some kind of massive intervention pretty soon, maybe a one-time deal. But Russia's economy is in deep trouble, partly from the sanctions, partly because of the drastic drop in oil prices, and also because the economy was in recession from the very beginning of this year anyway, the Ukraine crisis aside. So I think Vladimir Putin has basically stuck. He needs to deliver some kind of political victory. If not, steady the free fall of the ruble, then something abroad in foreign policy. And that's another thing that leads me to believe there could be an offensive, meaning going into the winter, that Russia has to show something more to its own people for what's happened in Ukraine, for what they got in Ukraine, than the current limited republics of Donetsk and Lugansk.
Could you see a political offensive in Beijing and in Brisbane? Do you think that, obviously the topic of Ukraine will come up. What do you think could or should come out of these meetings with all these world leaders here in the next week?
Well, first, I'll make a comment about China. I think Russia will continuously turn to China to finance various projects. In fact, even today, Gennady Timchenko announced that the massive LNG plant in Yamal, which is many billions of dollars, $27 billion, that they're turning to China to help finance that. And there'll be other projects along those lines. And the Russians will undoubtedly speak to the Chinese about getting their banks involved, essentially to supplement what used to be Western investment, because they can't get access to, Western financial markets anymore. As far as negotiations, there might be some side talks with Western leaders, but most of the key players, such as the Ukrainians, will not be engaged at APEC. And no deal can come without them being present. In fact, right now, I think if anything, there might be some negative encounters with countries like Australia over flight MH17. The Australians intend to have a talk with the Russians. And I doubt President Obama is going to have any nice words for them either.
Exactly. Tony Abbott saying just last week that, of course, we're going to invite him, but I plan to talk to Putin about MH17. You mentioned the ceasefire just a moment ago. It seems that it has been in place, but it hasn't been in place. It's been in place on paper. What will it take to tip that?
Well, I'll tell you this. The agreement was very vague when it was signed, even back in September. And many parts of it were quite open to interpretation by both parties. And both parties have been playing it to their advantage. What happened after the ceasefire was signed is fighting continued around Donetsk airport, but very much localized to that area. So clearly the separatists were restrained. The Ukraine's army was essentially done. They were defeated. If the separatists wanted to, they could have pushed. Obviously, they were being held back and only fighting in that small, limited area. So in that respect, overall, the ceasefire had held, right? The issue now may be, now that there have been elections, parliamentary elections in Ukraine, and these elections in the separatist regions as well, is that they're no longer interested in constraining the fighting to Donetsk, that they're willing to open another front. And we know this because the separatist leaders, when they ran for office, said, look, our goal is to have the borders of the republics we control to be the actual borders of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions. Well, the separatists only control less than half of the region, about half the population, right? And they want the rest. Mm-hmm. And I think it's simply a question of whether or not they try to get the rest now, or if they wait through the winter and they try to get the rest another time. But one way or another, the borders where this conflict settled are not good for the separatists. They're not happy.
That will be very interesting to watch. Michael Kofman, thank you so much for your time and your insight.